The letter was not supposed to exist. Commander Sorya Velkorath, first daughter of the Amber Throne, had written it in the dead hours between third watch and dawn, pressed against the bulkhead of her private quarters aboard the diplomatic frigate Tessarine, using ink she had synthesized from the ship's botanical reserves, because she did not trust any digital format that could be subpoenaed by her mother's intelligence directorate. 3 pages, handwritten, in the old Korvathi script that predated the Empire's current cipher protocols. And she had sealed it with thermal wax impressed with her personal sigil, the split-tailed Korva hawk, which meant it was classified as intimate correspondence under Korvathi sovereign law, punishable by tribunal censure for any party who opened it without the named recipient's consent. The named recipient was Sergeant First Class Cole Erickson, Terran Diplomatic Protection Detail, currently assigned as security liaison to the Korvathi courtship delegation on neutral station Almari. Sorya's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Mevra, had been instructed to deliver the letter by hand during the station's scheduled maintenance blackout, when surveillance feeds cycled offline for 9 minutes. Mevra had crossed 2 transit corridors, passed through a service junction, and was 14 steps from the human security barracks when Senior Arbiter Draven Helkorath, Sorya's uncle, chief architect of the Courtship Tribunal that would determine the political future of her bloodline, intercepted her with 3 tribunal marshals and a scanning wand. He broke the seal in front of her. Mevra protested. She cited Article 9 of the Intimate Correspondence Statute, the sovereign immunity of personal sigils, the diplomatic protections afforded to sealed communications between officers of allied species. Draven listened to all of it with the patient expression of a man listening to rain fall on stone. Then he read the letter. Then he folded it precisely along its original creases, placed it in a tribunal evidence pouch, and told Mevra to inform his niece that the Courtship Tribunal would convene at 800. That was how it started. Not with ceremony, not with negotiation, not with the carefully staged diplomatic theater that both species had rehearsed for months. It started with a middle-aged Korvathi arbiter reading his niece's private words under fluorescent corridor light, his silver-white brow ridges drawing together as the sentences registered, his four-fingered hand tightening on the page until the thermal wax cracked and fell to the deck plating in amber shards. The letter did not contain a love confession, not in the way humans understood the term. Korvathi did not write love letters. They wrote recognition petitions, formal declarations that a specific individual had demonstrated qualities sufficient to warrant consideration as a bonded partner. The petition carried legal weight. Once submitted and accepted, it triggered a courtship tribunal, a structured sequence of trials designed to test the petitioned individual's fitness, loyalty, and cultural compatibility. If the candidate survived all rounds, the bond was ratified. If the candidate failed, the petitioner forfeited the right to petition again for that individual permanently. Sorya had written a recognition petition for a human. The first one in Korvathi recorded history, and her uncle had just intercepted it. Cole Erickson learned about the letter 40 minutes later, when Sorya's younger sister Tavi appeared at the door of his quarters at 3:40 station time, her pale gold skin flushed dark amber with what he had learned to recognize as Korvathi distress coloring. She was 17 by Terran reckoning, slight, sharp-featured, with the same large dark amber eyes as her sister, but without the composed authority that Sorya wore like body armor. "He has it," Tavi said without preamble. "Uncle Draven. He intercepted Mevra in C corridor with the petition. He broke the seal." Cole was standing in his doorway in a gray undershirt and fatigued trousers, barefoot, his sidearm holstered on the wall mount behind him. He had been reviewing security rotation schedules. He was 34 years old, built like a man who had done manual labor before he had done soldiering, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, broken nose reset twice, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow where a piece of hull shrapnel had caught him during the Brevari incident, dark hair cropped regulation short, jaw that needed a shave 12 hours ago. "What petition?" he said. Tavi stared at him. "She didn't tell you." "Tell me what?" The girl's distress coloring deepened. She looked over her shoulder, confirming the corridor was empty, then stepped close enough that her voice would not carry. "My sister wrote a recognition petition for you." She was going to present it formally at the closing banquet, after the trade compact was signed, so it couldn't be blocked on diplomatic grounds. But she sent a personal copy to you first, the sealed letter, because Korvathi law requires the subject of a petition to be informed privately before the public filing. It's a courtesy provision, and Uncle Draven just used it to trigger the tribunal early. Cole processed this in the way he processed most unexpected tactical information, silently, completely, without visible reaction. His left hand, resting on the doorframe, did not tighten. His breathing did not change. 14 years of military service had trained the startle reflex out of him so thoroughly that the absence of reaction was, in its own way, the most telling reaction Tavi could have received. "Explain the tribunal to me," he said. "Everything. Start from what happens if I don't show up." Tavi explained. Her words came fast, precise. A younger sister who had grown up watching legal proceedings the way other children watched entertainment feeds. The Courtship Tribunal was a 5-round evaluation, evaluated by a panel of 7 arbiters, all of whom answered to her uncle. If the candidate refused to participate, the petitioner forfeited her petition rights permanently, and the senior arbiter gained legal standing to file a counterpetition on behalf of the Korvathi branch. Draven had 3 candidates from allied houses already prepared, conservative nobles who would absorb Soria into their political structure and neutralize her as a threat to Draven's ambitions for the Amber Throne succession. If the candidate participated and failed any single round, same result. If the candidate participated and passed all 5 rounds, the bond was ratified. "He designed the timing to make it impossible," Tavi said. "Normally a candidate gets 90 days to prepare, the formal notification period. He's giving you 4 hours. 4 hours against 5 rounds that Korvathi nobles train for from childhood." "I understand," Cole said. "Where's the tribunal chamber?" Tavi's expression shifted. The distress coloring receded slightly, replaced by something harder, more assessing. She had her sister's eyes, Cole realized, not just the color, the depth, the way they measured. "Sergeant Erickson, my sister is the most formidable person I have ever known. She commanded a border fleet at 23. She held the Tessarines Bridge during the Cascade raids when half her crew was incapacitated by radiation sickness, and she did it for 9 days without sleep. She has never once in her entire life submitted a recognition petition for anyone, not for the Solaran Prince who offered her a joint fleet command. Not for the Thyrani warlord who won 3 consecutive campaign honors in her name. No one. The fact that she wrote one for you means something that I do not think you understand yet." "I understand it fine," Cole said quietly. "Diplomatic amphitheater level 3. Level 3. I'll be there at 7:55. He closed the door, sat on his bunk for exactly 30 seconds with his eyes closed. Then he stood, opened his footlocker, and retrieved the Korvathi Cultural Reference Manual he had been reading for the past 6 weeks, not because it was part of his security briefing, but because he had wanted to understand the people he worked beside. Because that was what Cole Erickson did. He paid attention. He had 4 hours. He used every minute. At 4:30, he was cross-referencing the Korvathi genealogical records against the cultural archives, sovereign history files, drilling the pronunciation of ancestral names in Old Script Korvathi, until his accent was clean enough that an arbiter could not disqualify the recitation on phonetic grounds. At 5:30, he was reviewing the Sathara ceremonial meal preparation, 7 courses, prescribed ingredients, the ritual intention spoken at the final course, cross-checking the station commissary's inventory against the recipe requirements and identifying substitutions for 3 ingredients that would not be available. At 6:30, he ironed his dress uniform, polished his boots, and shaved for the first time in 3 days. At 7:15, he walked to the amphitheater and found Mevra waiting outside the entrance. Sorya's aide-de-camp stood at parade rest, her posture rigid, her face carrying the controlled fury of a woman who had failed to deliver a letter and was holding herself responsible for everything that had followed. "Sergeant Erickson," she said, "Commander Velkorath asked me to convey that you are not obligated." "I know," Cole said. "Is she inside?" "She arrived at 700. She has been seated in the petitioner's alcove for 15 minutes. She has not spoken to anyone." Cole nodded. Mevra looked at him, studied him, really, with the evaluating gaze that Korvathi military officers used on junior personnel, and that Cole had learned to recognize as a form of respect when directed at someone who was not junior. Whatever she found in his face satisfied something, because she stepped aside without another word and watched him walk through the amphitheater entrance with an expression that was no longer fury. It was something closer to hope, and she did not try to hide it. The Courtship Tribunal convened in Almery Station's diplomatic amphitheater at 800 sharp. Senior Arbiter Draven had requisitioned the space overnight, citing emergency procedural grounds. A recognized petition, once intercepted by an arbiter of sufficient rank, could not be suppressed or delayed without grounds for suspicion of fraud. Draven had no such grounds. What he had was speed, surprise, and a tribunal panel stacked with 6 arbiters from conservative Korvathi houses who viewed interspecies bonding as somewhere between diplomatic embarrassment and biological heresy. The 7th arbiter was a retired fleet admiral named Kesara Velmorath, who had served with Sorya's mother before the Amber Throne's political fracture, and who had, according to Tavi, the integrity of a loaded cannon and the temperament to match. She was 83 years old, silver-haired, sharp-jawed, with eyes that looked like they had been evaluating men for the better part of a century and had found most of them wanting. Her appointment to the permanent tribunal roster predated Draven's authority by 11 years. He could not remove her without triggering a procedural challenge that would delay the tribunal, and delay was the last thing Draven wanted. His advantage was surprise. He would not waste it. Cole walked into the amphitheater at 7:55 in his dress uniform dark charcoal, with the silver Terran diplomatic insignia on his collar, boots polished to regulation standard, his jaw freshly shaved for the first time in 3 days, and found 300 Korvathi observers already seated in the tiered galleries above the tribunal floor. The amphitheater was built for acoustic projection. Pale stone walls carved with genealogical friezes, a vaulted ceiling with daylight panels simulating a Korvathi afternoon sky, the tribunal dais elevated at the far end with 7 high-backed chairs arranged in a crescent. The air smelled of citrus resin, a Korvathi ceremonial incense that Cole had been told was meant to clarify judgment. The real purpose, he suspected, was to make the room feel ancient and intimidating. It succeeded. Sorya was already seated in the petitioner's alcove to the left of the dais, a recessed bench behind a low stone balustrade, positioned so the petitioner could observe but not intervene. She wore her formal command uniform, deep amber fabric with gold thread at the collar and cuffs, her dark auburn hair pulled back in a military braid that exposed the sharp architecture of her face. Pale gold skin, high cheekbones, the faint luminescent tracery along her temples that marked her bloodline, a genetic heritage of the Velkorath ruling house, subtle enough to pass as ornamental scarring in dim light, unmistakable in the amphitheater's bright panels. Each line was finer than a human capillary, woven in branching patterns from temple to jaw, and they pulsed with a faint warm light when her circulation elevated. Stress, emotion, fear. The Korvathi equivalent of a heart monitor, written in the skin where everyone could see it. Right now the tracery was still, controlled. She had spent a lifetime learning to control it. Her eyes found Cole the instant he entered. Large, dark amber, steady. No panic, no apology. No, the situation has changed, you don't have to do this. Retreat. Just recognition. The same look she had given him 6 weeks ago, when a malfunctioning pressure seal had blown out a viewport in the Tessarine's officer corridor, and Cole had shielded her with his body before either of them had processed what was happening. An instinct, not a decision. She had looked at him afterward with that exact expression, and he had not understood it then. He understood it now. He took his position at the candidate's mark, a circle of inlaid brass in the center of the tribunal floor, worn smooth by centuries of candidates who had stood in it before him, and faced the panel. Senior Arbiter Draven rose from the center chair. He was tall even for a Korvathi, silver-haired, with a face like chiseled granite and eyes the color of tarnished copper. His formal arbiter's robe was deep black with gold trim, and he held the intercepted letter in his left hand like a piece of evidence at a criminal proceeding. This tribunal convenes to evaluate the fitness of the petitioned candidate Sergeant First Class Cole Erickson, Terran species, non-bonded, non-propertied, assigned rank of security liaison, in response to a recognition petition filed by Commander Soria Velkorath, first daughter of the Amber Throne. He paused. Let the weight of non-bonded, non-propertied settle into the room like sediment in still water. The candidate will face 5 rounds of evaluation. Failure in any round terminates the petition permanently. The candidate may withdraw at any time, with equivalent result. He looked down at Cole from the elevated dais with an expression that was not quite contempt. It was closer to certainty. The certainty of a man who had designed a machine specifically to produce one outcome. Round 1, Recitation of Lineage. A murmur moved through the galleries. Cole heard it the way a soldier hears incoming fire, registering trajectory, assessing threat, categorizing it as noise and dismissing it. Recitation of lineage was a Korvathi tradition requiring the candidate to recite, from memory, 7 generations of both their own ancestry and the petitioner's ancestry, including titles, holdings, and notable deeds. For a Korvathi candidate raised in the imperial system, this was rote knowledge drilled from childhood. For a human who had grown up in a mining settlement on Callisto and joined the Terran military at 18, it was supposed to be an impossible wall. That was the point. Round 1 was designed to end this before it began. Cole stood at the brass circle. 300 Korvathi observers watched. 7 arbiters waited. In the petitioner's alcove, Soria's hands rested on the stone balustrade, and they were perfectly still. He began. Not with his own lineage, which was the traditional order, and which Draven was clearly expecting, because the Terran genealogical record was thin by Korvathi standards and could be dismissed as insufficient within minutes. Cole began with Soria's. Soria Velkorath, first daughter of Empress Regent Kalaya Velkorath, born in the year of the Amber Eclipse, who assumed the regency after the death of Emperor Valen Velkorath during the Cascade Raids, and held the Amber Throne through 7 succession challenges without yielding her seat. Kalaya Velkorath, daughter of High Admiral Thesson Velkorath and Judiciary Consort Lureth Vel Esrin, who expanded the border fleet from 47 vessels to 112, and negotiated the Neutral Corridor Treaty with Terran High Command, the first diplomatic accord between our species. He continued, 7 generations. Names, titles, engagements, holdings, the specific campaign honors that each ancestor had earned, the political marriages they had entered, and the alliances those marriages had sealed. He recited the Velkorath lineage with the precision of a man who had spent every free hour of the past 6 weeks memorizing it from the Tessarine's cultural database, not because he had known about the petition, not because he had any reason to believe he would ever need this knowledge, but because he had wanted to understand the woman he served beside. Her history was her architecture. He wanted to understand the architecture. When he reached the 7th generation, sovereign Caliph Velkorath, who had unified the 3 Korvathi provinces under the first Amber throne 900 years ago, the murmuring in the gallery had stopped. 300 pairs of amber eyes were fixed on a human who was reciting their founding sovereign's deeds in flawless old script pronunciation. Then Cole recited his own lineage. His grandmother, Elsa Eriksson, 41 years on the Callisto mining platforms, shift supervisor, died at her console during the pressure failure of 2187. His grandfather, Marcus Eriksson, whose hand tools Cole still carried in his footlocker. His father, David Eriksson, 22 years of military service, retired as a master sergeant, drove a hauler on Callisto before that. His mother, Anna Eriksson, civil engineer, designed the water treatment plant that served 12,000 settlers on Titan's northern plateau. He gave each name with the same weight, the same respect, the same quiet authority he had given the Korvathi sovereigns, because that was the point. That was the only point that mattered. The amphitheater was silent when he finished. Arbiter Kesara, the retired admiral, leaned forward in her chair. The faintest trace of something moved across her ancient face, not surprise, not approval, something older than both, recognition of competence. The recitation is complete and accurate. Round 1, passed. Draven's expression did not change. He had 5 rounds. He only needed 1 failure. Round 2, he said. Trial of provision. The trial of provision evaluated whether the candidate could sustain a household. In Korvathi terms, this meant demonstrating the ability to provide shelter, nourishment, and material security appropriate to the petitioner's station. For a candidate petitioning into the Velkorath bloodline, this traditionally meant proving control of estates, military commands, or economic resources equivalent to a provincial governor. Draven had added a practical component. The candidate was given 2 hours and access to the station's general commissary to prepare a formal Korvathi ceremonial meal, a Vel Sathara, the 7-course ritual feast that a bonded partner traditionally prepared on the anniversary of recognition. Each course had prescribed ingredients, preparation techniques, and presentation standards codified in imperial tradition. The meal was evaluated on accuracy, execution, and what the Korvathi called Velnorath, the intent behind the hands. A phrase that sounded poetic but was, in practical terms, a subjective evaluation that the arbiters could use to fail anyone they wanted to fail. Cole had 2 hours. A commissary designed for alien dietary needs he had studied but never cooked for, and the knowledge that every ingredient, every preparation technique, every presentation detail would be judged against centuries of tradition by people who expected him to fail. He did not waste time on uncertainty. He moved through the commissary with the systematic efficiency of a man who had read the Vel Sathara preparation manual in the Tessarine's cultural archive 3 weeks ago, not because he had anticipated this trial, but because Soria had mentioned once, in passing, during a security briefing that ran late into the evening watch, that the Vel Sathara was the only tradition she truly missed from the Amber Court. She had said it quietly, almost to herself, the way people share things they do not expect anyone to remember. Cole had remembered. 3 of the 7 courses were flawless: the pressed grain salad, the ember-roasted root medley, and the chilled Kelvari nectar that served as the palate bridge between the 3rd and 4th courses. 2 were strong but imperfect. The braised shoulder cut was slightly underdone by Korvathi standards, though the seasoning was accurate, and the savory custard had set unevenly, because Cole had been forced to use a convection oven calibrated for Terran food service, rather than the radiant stone hearth that the recipe prescribed. The Sorathi broth, the ceremonial opener, the course that set the tone for the entire meal, was where Cole made his first deliberate departure. The station stores had no Kelsar leaf, the aromatic herb that gave the broth its signature warmth. Cole substituted rosemary, not randomly. He had cross-referenced the chemical compound profiles of both herbs in the Tessarine's botanical database during a late-night study session, and rosemary shared 87% of Kelsar Leaf's aromatic signature. He explained this to the panel calmly, without defensiveness, the way a competent cook explains an adaptation to difficult conditions, not as an apology, but as evidence that he understood what the original was supposed to taste like, and had found the closest path to it with the materials at hand. The seventh course, the pressed seed cake that served as the emotional centerpiece of the Velsathara, was where Cole departed from tradition entirely. The seed cake was traditionally accompanied by a spoken intention, a formal statement of what the preparer was offering the recipient. Korvathi candidates typically offered estates, fleet commands, political alliances, or ancestral holdings. Cole set the seed cake on the presentation stone, looked at the panel and said, in Korvathi, "I do not have estates, I do not command a fleet, I cannot provide what your tradition expects a candidate to provide. What I can provide is this: I will learn what I do not know, I will adapt where I cannot replicate, and I will never present her with something I have not put my full effort into, even when the result is imperfect. Because perfection is not the point, attention is. And I have been paying attention." Two of the conservative arbiters exchanged a glance. The third wrote something on his evaluation tablet. Arbiter Kesara tasted the Sorathi broth, set the bowl down and said, "The rosemary works." Round 2 passed. Draven called a 10-minute recess. During the recess, Cole stood in the corridor outside the amphitheater and drank water from a standard-issue canteen. His hands were steady. His dress uniform smelled faintly of Korvathi cooking spices, Sorathi pepper and ember char, and the ghost of rosemary. Two Korvathi guards stood at the far end of the corridor, watching him with an expression he could not quite categorize. Not hostility, not warmth. Curiosity. The kind that had not yet decided what it was looking at. Tavi appeared at his elbow. She had been monitoring from the gallery, and her face carried the particular tension of someone who knew what was coming and could not stop it. "Uncle Draven is adjusting round 3, she said quietly. "He's swapping the standard cultural knowledge examination for a combat trial. He has the authority the tribunal charter allows the senior arbiter to substitute equivalent tests at his discretion, provided the substitute evaluates the same core competency. He's calling it an evaluation of physical resilience and protective capacity." "Who's the opponent?" Tavi's jaw tightened. Commander Vestral held Draven, his son, decorated close combat instructor at the Imperial War College, 12 tournament victories in sanctioned arena bouts. 3 combat kills in formal duels, all legal under Korvathi Honor Code. He's fought humans before, training exchanges with your Marines during the joint operations period. He won every bout. None of them lasted more than 90 seconds. "How big is he?" 6'8" in your measurements, 290 pounds. Bone density roughly 1.4 times human standard. He trains 6 hours a day. Cole drank the last of his water and capped the canteen. "Anything else?" "He's fast. Don't assume size means slow. Korvathi fast-twitch muscle fiber is different from yours. He will be faster than you expect." "Good to know." Round 3 filled the amphitheater to capacity. Word had spread through the station overnight and then accelerated during the first 2 rounds. The human security sergeant had survived lineage and provision. Now there was going to be blood. Observers who had no connection to the Korvathi delegation, Terran merchants, Thyrani contractors, station maintenance crews on break, crowded the upper gallery tiers, standing room only, faces pressed between the stone columns for a view of the sand ring. The combat trial was conducted in a ring 20 feet in diameter, recessed into the amphitheater floor, and filled with fine silicate sand that absorbed impact, and Cole noted clinically, made footing unpredictable for anyone not accustomed to fighting on it. The rules were traditional Korvathi. No weapons, no armor, no augmentation, no strikes to eyes or throat. The bout ended when one combatant was pinned, unconscious, or yielded. There was no time limit, no standing 8 count, no referee intervention. Commander Vestral Hel Draven entered the ring first. He was everything Tavi had described and worse, a wall of pale silver muscle, with the same tarnished copper eyes as his father, moving with the fluid economy of a man who had been trained to break bodies since childhood. He wore a sleeveless sparring tunic that showed the ritual scarring on his arms, 12 parallel lines on each forearm, one for each tournament victory, each scar deliberately kept from healing smooth as a permanent record of combat proved. His expression was not hostile, it was professional, the expression of a man performing a task he was confident in. Cole entered the ring in his undershirt and fatigue trousers, barefoot on the sand. 187 pounds of mining colony muscle and military conditioning, against a Korvathi combat specialist who outweighed him by 100 pounds, and had reach, speed, and species-level bone density, advantages that no amount of training could close. The gallery was silent. In the petitioner's alcove, Sorya's hands on the stone balustrade had gone white at the knuckles. The tracery at her temples pulsed once a single flare of amber light, and then she brought it under control. The arbiter's bell rang. Vestral came forward like a tide. Fast, controlled, leading with a sweeping low strike aimed at Cole's forward knee, designed to collapse the joint and end the bout in seconds. It was textbook Korvathi close combat doctrine. Overwhelm early, exploit the physiological advantage. Do not let the smaller opponent find rhythm. Cole did not try to block the strike. Blocking it would have been like blocking a truck. He stepped into it, inside Vestral's reach, and drove his elbow into the nerve cluster beneath the Korvathi's left armpit, a target he knew existed, because he had spent 4 weeks studying Korvathi anatomy texts in the Tessarine's medical library. Initially to understand how to provide field first aid to Sorya's crew during the next crisis, and subsequently because he had wanted to understand the physiology of the people she came from. The nerve cluster was a known vulnerability in Korvathi combatives training. Every Korvathi fighter knew it existed. But nobody expected a human to know where it was. Vestral's arm went dead for 2 seconds. Long enough for Cole to rotate behind him, lock both arms around the Korvathi's torso, and leverage his lower center of gravity against Vestral's higher mass to throw the champion off balance. Not to the ground, Vestral was too heavy and too trained for that, but off balance enough that he staggered forward into the sand ring's stone boundary wall and had to catch himself one-handed. The gallery erupted, not in cheers, in shock. A collective intake of breath followed by the particular murmur of a room recalculating its assumptions in real time. Cole had heard that sound before in different contexts. It was the sound of surprise meeting competence. Vestral recovered in seconds. His dead arm came back online. He turned, reassessed, and came at Cole with a different strategy, measured, patient, using his reach advantage to keep Cole at distance, probing for openings with precise combinations that tested Cole's guard without overcommitting. This was the Vestral who had won 12 tournaments, the version that did not underestimate. The next 4 minutes were the worst of Cole's life. Vestral landed 3 clean strikes that Cole could not avoid, one to the ribs that cracked something with an audible snap, one to the jaw that split his lip and filled his mouth with copper, one to his outer thigh that would bruise the size of a dinner plate and degrade his lateral movement for days. Cole absorbed each one the way a boxer absorbs punches in the championship rounds, rolling with impact, giving ground strategically, keeping his hands up, protecting the center line. Waiting. Because Korvathi close combat doctrine had a structural flaw that 12 tournament victories had never exposed, it assumed the opponent was trying to win. Every Korvathi fighter Vestral had faced had come forward, attacked, committed to strikes that could be countered and leveraged. Cole was not trying to win. Cole was trying to last. And a fighter who is only trying to last is the most frustrating opponent in any combat system, because he absorbs punishment without retaliating, refuses to commit to attacks that create openings, and forces the aggressor to spend energy against a target that bends but does not break. At the 6-minute mark, 4 minutes longer than any of Vestral's previous bouts against humans, Vestral overextended. A powerful overhead strike aimed at Cole's collarbone, designed to end the fight with structural damage that would make continuation impossible. It was a finishing move, the kind of strike a fighter throws when frustration has eroded the discipline that patience requires. Cole dropped under it, caught Vestral's wrist on the downswing. Used the Korvathi's own momentum and body weight 290 pounds, committed to a downward arc, to pull the arm into a joint lock that hyperextended the elbow past its natural range. Vestral did not yield. His face tightened. His free hand came around, reaching for Cole's head, trying to break the lock through brute force. Cole adjusted the angle, applied pressure, and felt the joint approach its limit. "I don't want to break your arm," Cole said in Korvathi, quietly. Not a threat, not bravado, a statement of fact from a man who meant it and wanted that to be clear. Vestral looked up at him from the sand. His copper eyes were wide, not with pain, but with the particular shock of a man recognizing something he did not expect to find. He had fought humans before. He had beaten them all. None of them had spoken to him in his own language while holding him in a lock he could not escape. None of them had offered mercy as a fact rather than a taunt. "Yield," Vestral said. The amphitheater did not erupt, it held its breath, and then from the arbiter's panel, Kesara's voice, dry as desert stone, "Round 3, passed." Cole released the lock, offered Vestral his hand. The gallery held its breath again. A Korvathi combat champion, freshly yielded, being offered a hand up by the man who had beaten him. This was not Korvathi tradition. Korvathi tradition required the defeated combatant to rise unaided as a demonstration that the yield was voluntary, not forced. Cole did not know this rule. Or perhaps he did, and had decided that Terran tradition, the tradition that said you helped a man to his feet after you fought him, because the fight was the fight and the respect was the respect, and they were not the same thing, outranked the protocol. Vestral looked at the hand, looked at Cole. Something crossed the champion's face that the gallery could see and the arbiters could see, and Soria, gripping the balustrade so tightly that the stone edge left marks on her palms, could see reassessment, not of tactics, of character. Vestral took the hand, rose to his feet with Cole's grip steadying him. The contact lasted 3 seconds, long enough that it was not incidental, short enough that it was not performance. The kind of grip between men who have measured each other through violence and found the measurement unexpectedly level. Vestral leaned close, spoke quietly enough that the gallery's acoustics could not carry it. "My father underestimated you. I will not make the same error." He released Cole's hand, nodded once, and walked out of the ring with the quiet dignity of a man who had lost a fight and found something he had not expected to find. He did not look at his father as he passed the arbiter's dais. He did not need to. The 12 scars on his forearms were his record, and he had just added a 13th one that would not be cut into his skin because it was not a victory. It was something else, something the Korvathi combat tradition did not have a mark for. In the gallery, a young Korvathi officer barely out of the academy, by the look of his rank insignia, turned to the woman beside him and whispered something. The woman, older, silver-haired, wearing the diplomatic service badge of the neutral corridor consulate, shook her head slowly and said, also in a whisper that carried further than she intended, "That was not what I expected." It was what none of them had expected. That was the problem with expecting the human to fail. The expectation left no room for what happened when he did not. Cole was treated in the amphitheater's medical alcove during the recess. A Korvathi field medic, a young woman with the efficient hands and neutral expression of someone trained to treat injuries without forming opinions about how they were acquired, wrapped his ribs with compression bandage, sealed the split lip with surgical adhesive, and offered a mild analgesic from the standard combat medicine kit. Cole refused the analgesic. He needed his reflexes intact. 2 more rounds. The medic looked at his ribs, looked at his face, and said nothing, but her hands were gentler than they needed to be, and that was a kind of verdict too. Soria appeared at the alcove entrance. She stood there for 3 seconds without speaking, framed by the stone archway, her command uniform immaculate, her braid tight, her posture parade perfect. The command mask she wore in every public setting, the one Cole had watched her maintain through trade negotiations, diplomatic dinners, emergency hull breaches, and 9 days of bridge command during the Cascade raids, was firmly in place. But her eyes were not part of the mask. They were bright with something that Cole's Korvathi vocabulary did not have a word for, and that his English vocabulary could only approximate as fierce, furious tenderness. "You're hurt," she said. "Cracked rib, maybe 2, nothing structural." "Cole," she used his first name, which she had never done in front of witnesses. The medic was 3 feet away. She used it anyway. "You do not have to continue. If you withdraw, there is no penalty to you, only to me, and my penalties are my own concern. I know that if you walk out of this amphitheater right now, your career is intact. Your posting is secure. My uncle cannot touch you diplomatically. The only person who loses is me. I know that too." She looked at him. The tracery at her temples pulsed once involuntary, a stress response she could not fully suppress, and then held steady, a warm amber glow that she was choosing not to hide. In front of the medic, in front of anyone who might see through the archway. She was letting her control slip, and she was doing it deliberately, because she wanted him to see what it cost her to stand in that doorway and offer him the exit she hoped he would not take. "Why?" she asked, one word, quiet enough that the medic could not hear. Cole looked at her steadily. "Because the letter was real. And you deserve a candidate who treats it that way." She held his gaze for 2 more seconds. Then she turned and walked back to her alcove without another word, her boot heels clicking on the stone floor with the measured cadence of a woman who had learned to walk away from things she wanted to stay near. But the luminescent tracery at her temples did not dim. It brightened, and it stayed bright for the rest of the day. Round 4, the Inquisition of Intent. This was the round Draven had been saving. The Inquisition was a verbal trial in which the tribunal panel interrogated the candidate about their intentions, motivations, and understanding of the bond they were seeking. In theory, a good faith evaluation. In practice, an open field for a senior arbiter who wanted a specific outcome. Draven made it a prosecution. "Sergeant Erickson, you are a non-bonded, non-propertied member of a species that the Korvathi ascendancy has had formal diplomatic relations with for 11 years. Your security clearance is provisional. Your species has no recognized courtship tradition that the tribunal can evaluate against our standards. You possess no landed estate, no military command, no economic assets beyond your service salary. By every metric this tribunal uses to evaluate candidate fitness, you are categorically unqualified." He paused. Let the silence do its work. 300 observers, 7 arbiters, the weight of a civilization's judgment focused on a single brass circle in the floor. "So I will ask you directly, Sergeant. Why should this tribunal ratify a bond between the first daughter of the Amber Throne and a man who, by our standards, has nothing?" Soria's hands were still on the balustrade. Tavi, seated 3 rows up in the observer gallery, had stopped breathing. The 2 Korvathi guards from the corridor, the ones who had watched Cole with unresolved curiosity, were standing at the gallery entrance, and they had not blinked. Cole stood at the brass circle. His ribs hurt. His lip throbbed. His jaw was swelling where Vestral's fist had connected. He looked like a man who had been through a fight because he had. He did not look like a man who was going to apologize for it. "Arbiter Draven," he said. His voice carried without strain. The amphitheater's acoustics did the work. "You're right. By your metrics, I have nothing. No estates, no fleet, no bloodline that your system recognizes. I grew up in a mining settlement on a moon most humans have never heard of. My father drove a hauler for 22 years before he enlisted. My mother built water treatment plants. The most valuable thing I owned before I joined the service was a set of hand tools my grandfather left me when he died at his work console." He paused, not for effect, for precision. The next words mattered, and he wanted them to land clean. "But you're measuring the wrong things. You're measuring what I have. You should be measuring what I do. Because everything I've done in this tribunal today, the lineage I memorized, the meal I prepared, the fight I stayed in when I could have walked out, I did because I paid attention. Not to your customs as an obligation I was forced to fulfill. To her, to who she is, to what matters to her. I learned your lineage because she carries it and it is part of who she is. I learned your cooking because she grew up eating it and she misses it. I studied your anatomy because I wanted to understand what it means to stand beside someone whose body is different from mine and whose heart is not. And I fought your champion because walking away would have meant that the letter she wrote, the most courageous single document I have ever been informed of, meant nothing." The amphitheater was silent, not the shocked silence of round 3, a different silence, heavier, the silence of a room hearing something it did not want to hear, because hearing it meant rearranging what it believed about who deserved to stand in that circle. Cole kept his eyes on Draven. "You asked why this tribunal should ratify the bond. I'm not going to argue with your metrics. I'm going to tell you what I know. Your niece wrote a recognition petition for the first time in her life. She's been offered alliances by princes and warlords. She refused them all. And then she chose someone your system says is unqualified. The question you should be asking isn't why she chose me. It's what your system is failing to measure that she already saw." Draven's expression did not crack, but his hand, the one holding the intercepted letter, shifted. The fingers loosened by a fraction, an involuntary micro-movement that a man with less control would not have made and a man with more control would have suppressed. Cole registered it. Soria, from her alcove, registered it too. One of the conservative arbiters, Arbiter Tesson, a broad-shouldered woman with the ceremonial scars of a former provincial judge, set her evaluation tablet down on the armrest of her chair and looked at Cole for a long moment. She had voted against him in every previous round. Her expression now was unreadable, but her tablet remained face down, and she did not pick it up again. Arbiter Kesara spoke into the silence. "The candidate's response is noted. Panel, cast your evaluation." The vote was conducted by raised hand, the traditional method for Inquisition rounds, because the Korvathi believed that a judge should be willing to show their judgment publicly. Kesara raised her hand first. Then the arbiter to her left, a retired magistrate named Horath Vel Sen, who had spent the first 3 rounds with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral. Then a third arbiter, Tesson, the former provincial judge. She raised her hand slowly, as if the arm weighed more than it had that morning. 4 votes to pass, 3 against. Kesara's vote had not been the tiebreaker, Tesson's had. Draven looked at Tesson. Tesson looked back at him with the steady, unyielding expression of a woman who had just changed her mind and was not going to explain why. Draven called no recess before round 5. Round 5, the declaration. The final round required the candidate to make a formal declaration of bond intent to the petitioner, spoken aloud before the full tribunal in the petitioner's language. The declaration was unrehearsed, unscripted, and evaluated not on content but on what the Korvathi called vel theron, the weight of truth. The panel judged whether the candidate's words carried genuine conviction. There was no rubric, no scoring matrix, no objective standard. 7 arbiters listened, and they either believed the words were real or they did not. It was the most subjective round. It was also the most important, because the Korvathi understood something about bonds that most civilizations did not. You could test fitness, provision, combat ability, and intent with structured evaluations. You could not test truth. You could only hear it. Cole crossed the amphitheater floor from the brass circle to the petitioner's alcove. 20 feet. His footsteps echoed in the stone room. 300 observers tracked him. 7 arbiters watched. Draven sat rigid in his center chair, the intercepted letter in his hand, his face the same chiseled granite it had been at 800. Sorya rose from the bench behind the balustrade. She stood at her full height, taller than Cole by 2 inches, shoulders straight, the formal command uniform sharp, the gold thread at her collar catching the daylight panels. The luminescent tracery at her temples pulsed steadily, no longer controlled, no longer hidden. Her dark amber eyes were fixed on Cole, and they were bright and wet, and they did not waver. Cole stopped at the balustrade, close enough to speak without the amphitheater's acoustics projecting his words to the galleries. Close enough that this was, for one moment, not a tribunal performance but a conversation between 2 people who had spent 6 months learning each other's architecture without knowing that was what they were doing. He spoke in Korvathi. Commander Sorya Velkorath, I did not read the letter you wrote. Your uncle intercepted it before it reached me. I do not know the exact words you used or the formal structure you chose. I do not know if you agonized over the phrasing or if it came easily. I do not know if you sealed it with your sigil because protocol required it or because you wanted me to know when I held it that it was yours. He paused. The amphitheater was so quiet he could hear the ventilation system cycling through the ceiling panels. But I know you wrote it, and I know what writing it cost you, the risk to your command, the ammunition it gave your uncle, the vulnerability of putting your name on a document that said, in front of your entire civilization, this human matters to me enough that I am willing to stake my future on him. You did that knowing every arbiter on this panel would look at me and see a man without estates, without command, without bloodline. You did it anyway, because you decided that what you saw in me was worth more than what your system was designed to measure. His voice was steady, not loud, not performed. The voice of a man who had learned to say hard things quietly because the quiet was where the truth lived. I cannot match your lineage. I cannot match your rank or your fleet record or your political standing, but I can match your courage. You wrote a letter that said I was worth choosing. I am standing here, cracked ribs, split lip, 4 rounds deep in a tribunal designed to break me, saying you were right, not because I passed your tests. Because you were right before the tests began. You were right the first time you looked at me and saw someone who paid attention. That is what I am. That is what I will be. And if this tribunal needs a word for it, then the word is Vel Theron. Sorya's eyes had not left his. The luminescent tracery at her temples was fully bright now, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, gold light branching along her skin in patterns that 300 observers could read as clearly as written text. In Korvathi physiological terms, she was completely exposed. Her emotional state broadcast in bioluminescent signals that every person in the amphitheater could see and interpret. There was no command mask. There was no control. There was a woman standing in front of her civilization with her heart visible in her skin, and she was not looking away. She reached across the balustrade and placed her hand over his. In Korvathi tradition, this gesture had a name, Velsarath, the petitioner's seal. It could only be initiated by the petitioner, never by the candidate, and it signified that the candidate's declaration carried Vel Theron genuine truth, verified not by the panel but by the one person whose judgment the petition existed to honor. It was the most public, most irrevocable statement a Korvathi could make about another person. Once given, it could not be retracted. Not by arbiters, not by the Amber Throne, not by the petitioner herself. Draven stood from his chair. The tribunal has not voted on the declaration, he said. His voice was controlled, but something moved underneath it, the sound of a structure bearing weight it was not designed to hold. "Petitioner has accepted," Kesara said from her seat. She had not stood. She did not need to. Her voice carried the weight of 83 years and a career that had outlasted 6 senior arbiters. Under Article 17 of the Courtship Charter, the petitioner's physical acceptance of a Vel Theron declaration constitutes ratification independent of panel vote. The provision exists specifically to prevent tribunal manipulation by interested parties. She let that last phrase settle. "The bond is sealed. This tribunal is concluded." Draven looked at his fellow arbiters. 2 would not meet his eyes. A third was studying the intercepted letter in Draven's hand, with an expression that had shifted from certainty to something that would require a long walk and a quiet room to resolve. "Article 17 has not been invoked in 400 years, Draven said. "Then it was overdue," Kesara said. In the gallery, Tavi had both hands pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were wet, not crying, not the despair-coated tears the Korvathi considered undignified, but the bright, fierce wetness of someone watching something she had hoped for and had been afraid to believe in. 2 rows behind her, a Korvathi naval officer, one of Sorya's former bridge crew from the Tessarine, rose to his feet. Then another, then 4 more, then a dozen, standing in silence. In Korvathi military tradition, standing without sound was the highest form of acknowledgement, a gesture reserved for acts of recognized valor, given not by command but by choice. Sorya's hand was still over coals on the stone balustrade. Her fingers were warm, warmer than human skin. The tracery at her temples pulsed gold in the steady rhythm of a heart that had decided something and was not afraid of it. "You didn't read the letter," she said quietly. "No. Would you like to know what it said?" Cole looked at her, at the eyes that had measured him from the moment he stepped onto her ship 6 months ago, at the face that carried command and composure and centuries of expectation, and that was, right now, none of those things. At the luminescent lines that said, in a language older than words, "I chose you and I am not sorry and I would do it again." "Tell me," he said. "It said that I have served the Amber Throne for my entire life, that I have commanded ships and negotiated treaties, and held my ground against enemies who wanted me dead and allies who wanted me managed. That I have been offered recognition petitions by princes who wanted my fleet and warlords who wanted my bloodline and diplomats who wanted my influence, and I refused every one of them because not one of those men ever looked at me and saw anything other than the Amber Throne standing behind me." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. "And that in 6 months of watching a human security sergeant do his job quietly, without complaint, without asking for recognition, without once treating my crew as anything less than his own people, I learned something that none of those years of command taught me. I learned what it looked like when someone paid attention to the things that actually mattered, not because they were ordered to, not because they wanted something, because they chose to, because that was simply who they were." She paused. The tracery at her temples was still bright, still pulsing, and she was still not hiding it. "The last line of the letter," she said, "was a question. It asked, if a man like that exists in the universe, why would I choose anyone else?" The amphitheater was emptying. Arbiters filing out through the stone archways. Observers descending the gallery stairs in murmuring clusters. Draven had left his center chair, the intercepted letter still in his hand, his silver hair catching the daylight panels as he walked through the exit surrounded by tribunal marshals. He did not look back. Cole stood at the balustrade with Sorya's hand over his, and the taste of surgical adhesive on his lip, and the ache of cracked ribs wrapped tight against his chest. "For the record," he said, "the rosemary worked." The corner of her mouth moved, not a smile, something smaller and more honest, a crack in the architecture, voluntary, offered. "The rosemary was adequate. Coming from you, that's the highest compliment I've received today. And I got a yield out of a tournament champion." Adequate is higher than yield in my ranking system. Then I'll take it. She did not remove her hand. He did not ask her to. The daylight panels overhead shifted into the amber tones of Korvathi late afternoon, warm gold pouring over the pale stone walls and the empty arbiter chairs and the sand ring and the brass circle, and two people stood at a balustrade in a room that was emptying around them and did not move, because moving would have meant acknowledging that this was a moment, and moments, by definition, end. This one did not need to end yet. Across the amphitheater, near the main exit, Vestral held Draven paused in the archway. He had changed out of his sparring tunic into a formal duty uniform, and his left arm moved stiffly. The elbow Cole had hyperextended, would need medical attention and time. He stood in the archway for 5 seconds, watching Cole and Soria at the balustrade, and then he did something that no one in the gallery saw because the gallery was nearly empty, and that the surveillance feeds would not catch, because the maintenance blackout had been extended by station command for reasons that were never formally explained. He saluted. Not the Korvathi salute fist to chest, a gesture of rank acknowledgement. The Terran salute, right hand to the temple, fingers straight, a gesture he had learned during the joint operations training exchanges with the Terran Marines. He held it for 2 seconds, then dropped it, turned, and walked out. Cole, who had peripheral vision trained by 14 years of security work, saw it. He did not react, but the corner of his mouth moved by a millimeter, and Soria, whose hand was still over his and who was watching his face with the focused attention of a woman cataloging every detail for a record she would keep for the rest of her life, saw the movement and understood it even if she had not seen its cause. Some things did not need to be explained. They just needed to be witnessed. In the medical alcove afterward, ribs rewrapped, a fresh adhesive strip applied. The mild analgesic accepted this time because there were no more rounds to fight. Tavi sat on a supply crate across from Cole and said, with the particular directness of a 17-year-old who had been holding her breath for 10 hours, "You know she's going to be impossible now. She was already impossible. This is going to make it worse." Cole looked at Soria. Soria looked at Cole. The command mask was back, but it fit differently now, lighter, worn at an angle, like armor that had been adjusted to accommodate something it was not originally designed to hold. "I was always impossible," Soria said. "He just didn't have the clearance to know it yet." Cole laughed. It hurt his ribs. He did it anyway, and Soria's tracery pulsed once, warm and gold, and she let it. The Korvathi Diplomatic Archives would eventually record it as Case File 7741 Sigma, a procedural anomaly in the Courtship Tribunal system, resolved through invocation of Article 17, resulting in the first formally ratified interspecies recognition bond in Korvathi imperial history. The file would be stored in the restricted section, accessible only to senior judiciary officials, because Draven Helkorath would spend 3 years petitioning to have it sealed and would fail each time, because 7 arbiters and 300 witnesses had seen what happened in the amphitheater that day, and their testimony was on record, and records are the one thing an arbiter cannot intercept twice. But the real record was simpler than any archive could hold. A woman wrote a letter, a man stood up. And when it was over, they stood together.